He had that tall, lean look that Frederick Remington had given to our sort of national consciousness, that look of the cowboy. He looked the part and he talked the part. Laconic, slow speaking. When he spoke, he seemed the epitome of the Westerner. And he came eventually in his career to be identified as the great Western hero.
He had a personal attraction, you know, magnetism. When you saw him in person, it was overwhelming. He was very tall. He was about 6'4". And he had hands, enormous hands. You shook hands with him and you lost your own, you know. It was that down to there. And very, very kind, very quiet man.
Gary Cooper epitomized for us what the strong, virile, silent Western man, the way he behaved.
Cooper was always pure, uncorruptible, indomitable, in a quiet way. He was heroic. He had a personal purity. The movie makers picked up on it, and the image was created, and then the image extended.
His facial expressions and his whole demeanor came across to me with such warmth, tenderness, sensitivity, kindness, compassion, and a lot of men don't have that, but Gary Cooper had it, and I honestly believe it was all very natural from him.
Naturalness was his trademark and his stepping stone to fame. Gary Cooper radiated an honesty and integrity that captivated moviegoers for generations. But in many ways, the man who would one day be Hollywood's highest paid star was a product of his environment. He was born Frank James Cooper on May 7th, 1901. His parents, Charles and Alice Cooper, were originally from England. They met and married in Helena, Montana, which is where Frank was born. Charles Cooper was a well-respected and prosperous local judge. When Frank was 6 years old, his father purchased a ranch called the 7 Bar 9. It was about 40 miles from Helena.
It's a Western childhood. He grew up in Montana, the land of the big sky. He lived on a ranch. He went to school with Indian children at a one-room schoolhouse. He fraternized with the tough old cowboys that worked on his father's ranch. He absorbed and assimilated all of this. He became a cowboy almost involuntarily.
I think he thought it was about the best childhood a kid could have. It was hunting and fishing, and he had very good friends. The young Indian boys were his buddies, and I know he told me that they taught him a lot of what he knew about animals and nature and wildlife and tracking and riding. It was boy's dream.
But the dream changed when Frank was 8 years old. Not wanting her children to completely lose their English roots, Alice Cooper moved Frank and his older brother, Arthur, back to Great Britain so they could attend a proper English boarding school.
He wasn't too good in school. I don't think he had any interest at all. His mind was elsewhere. His mind roamed. He wanted to be an artist.
He talked about getting into fights with English boys because he was a Yankee and because he was unlettered. But I think he came back very well polished.
They remained overseas for 3 years. The outbreak of World War I brought the Cooper family home. Arthur, who was 6 years older than his brother, joined the Army. Frank continued his education without much distinction.
He never had scholastic motivation at any level. He had a good time, and he flunked out of a few schools, but he did ultimately graduate and even went to college for a while, where he was very popular and where he was nicknamed Cowboy Cooper.
After 2 years of college, Frank left school. He wanted to be a political cartoonist, but jobs were scarce in Helena. So he decided to join his parents, who had relocated to Palm Springs, California, just a stone's throw from the movie capital of the world. But his formative years in Montana would serve him well.
A lot of his activities on the ranch certainly were very, very helpful in him getting started in movies. It also gave him that Midwestern naturalness, which became very universal and made him so appealing to the public, because he didn't have any particular accent from the East, from the West. He was every man, and that's what kept him going in movies for 35 years.
23-year-old optimist, but he quickly found out that cartoonist jobs were just as scarce in Los Angeles as they were in Montana.
He tried to get into newspaper work. That didn't work. He became a door-to-door salesperson. That wasn't much fun. And then because of his writing habit, he got into movies.
He ran into some old cowboy buddies from Montana. And they told him, because he was quite broke, as he said, they said, hey, there's a good way to make some money, literally falling off a horse in front of a camera.
We're shooting a Western, you come by and go, you, and you, and you'd make $5 a day in a box lunch, and it was fun for a kid.
And there was plenty of work. Westerns were a staple of the silent film era.
The silent movies, a Western film was a nice genre to use because it didn't require a lot of title cards. If something was going to happen with action, bang, bang, you're dead. You didn't need a lot of explanation. It came out. So that was some of the reasons for the appeal. And people hated to see the Old West depart. There's still that nostalgia for it. And in the 10s and 20s and 30s, people could remember the time when the West was still there. And so for them, it was a trip backwards, a trip back into fantasy.
The skills that Frank had honed on the ranch earned him bit parts. He worked fairly regularly. Bitten by the acting bug, he soon yearned for bigger roles. In 1925, he had a minor part in the Rudolph Valentino film, The Eagle. Frank played one of the Cossacks. For a few years, he remained in the background. But eventually, Frank's writing skills, coupled with his handsome features, got him noticed.
He started doing these, charging up and hurling himself off. And that was how he got discovered. When the dust settled, people saw that he wasn't bad looking, and someone said, "You want to see this guy again."
His good looks came to the attention of this agent, Nan Collins, and she suggested that he take his money, $75, make a little screen test, and then she took that screen test of him riding a horse, getting off a horse, and walking in the door to various studios, and she kept pushing it around, pushing it around.
This agent not only convinced Frank to make his own screen test, which was unheard of, but she also suggested he change his name.
She was from Gary, Indiana, and they were apparently having this conversation one day when he was having fittings, and she said, "Well, I'm from Gary, Indiana. Gary's a nice name." And that's how it happened.
In 1926, the newly named Gary Cooper got his first big break.
His screen test came to the attention of Henry King, who hired him for a tiny bit part in The Winning of Barbara Worth. And while he was using him for a bit part, the actor assigned to a secondary lead was busy in another studio, and they said, well, hell, why do we have to wait for him? Let's use Cooper. And at first, the head of the studio, Sam Goldwyn, thought that Cooper was just too inept, too inefficient, but after seeing him do a dramatic scene, changed his mind.
Convinced he had discovered a future star, Goldwyn immediately tried to put Gary under contract for $65 a week. But Paramount upped the ante and offered the fledgling actor $150 a week. Cooper signed with Paramount. It proved to be a wise investment for the studio.
He did not have a large role in The Winning of Barbara Worth, but it was Western, and so this is for the body public. the genesis of the Gary Cooper Western image, and it was a big hit.
Critics raved about his performance. With this film, the career of Gary Cooper took off.
Cooper became closely identified with the Western film, but he never was straitjacketed by the Western like other stars like Tom Mix, for instance, had been. He could do other roles, and he did a wide variety of roles.
But Coop was not only recognized for his acting. Women adored him.
He was never a chaser. He was the chasee, as you would say. Now, women were after him. He was a desired object, and he was not inclined to resist.
Much to his embarrassment, because of one of his liaisons, gossip sheets referred to Gary as the It Boy.
His first girlfriend was the It girl, Clara Bow, whom he met in 1926. And Clara was the hottest thing in films. And he and Clara had a romance. And that's how he got his name. He was famous in Hollywood for his girlfriend before he became famous in films. And Clara got him into 3 of her movies. It, and Children of Divorce, and Wings. That won the first Academy Award for Best Picture. He had a very small part in that. He was killed. He was an airman who was killed and left behind a half-eaten chocolate bar. But it was a poignant part. And Clara pushed him.
With Clara Bow, the lure was sex. Now with Lupe Velez, who was the next in line, there was what you might call a tender love affair there, although it was pretty tempestuous because Lupe Velez was tempestuous.
And she so exhausted him, literally, emotionally, and physically, and he had so much pressure from the studio to drop her because they didn't want that type of marriage to happen and ruin his career. His mother was against it, that he actually had a physical collapse at the end of 1930, early 31.
But Lupe wasn't the only reason for Gary's exhaustion. Like most actors under studio contract, Gary was making as many as 5 movies a year. Gary was featured in 16 films before he left the silent movie world behind, when he made his first all-talking film, The Virginian, in 1929.
It's oft been filmed, but at no time was The Virginian better realized than by Gary Cooper in Victor Fleming's 1929 version. And it really cemented Cooper's position as a Western star and as a major Hollywood star.
It established that he could handle dialogue, that his voice, which was a nice baritone voice, mic'd well, and that it was suitable to a Western guy. It was slow and low. And so that was a big transition for him. Proved he could do it.
We get along just fine. Not that it's any of your business. Well, who's talking to you? I'm talking to you, Tramper. When I want to know anything from you, I'll tell you, you long-legged son of a... If you want to call me that, smile.
Many careers took nosedives after the advent of talking pictures, not because necessarily the actors couldn't talk clearly, but because their voices did not correspond with their personalities, their faces. Cooper's voice corresponded perfectly.
Gary Cooper was one of Paramount's top stars. He was cast in westerns, in dramas, and comedies. By 1931, he was earning $750 a week, which was not a spectacular sum, considering he was the studio's most versatile leading man.
Now I see.
Exhausted from work, feeling underpaid and despondent over his breakup with Lupe Velez, Gary decided to take a vacation in Europe. And while he was there, Gary met the next important woman in his life, a married countess named Dorothy DeFrasso.
Dorothy went after him just like some of the other women had gone after him, and he was drawn to the glitter of high society and what would evolve into the international jet set. And Dorothy DeFrasso was one of the important agents in sophisticating Gary Cooper.
The Countess DeFrasso taught Gary how to dress, to find clothes, taught him what to order in French restaurants. She taught him class. He had class, but not of the elite, and that's what the Countess taught him.
Gary also used the trip to Europe as a ploy to get a new contract.
He disappeared, pretended illness, but then was seen on the continent at famous nightclubs, then went to Africa on a safari, and came back to Hollywood. And at that point, unknown to his studio, Paramount, he desperately needed money. But the Countess and he put on a good show, and she negotiated a very high-priced contract. So he started out at $2,500 when he went back to work in 32, 33.
Gary not only got a raise, he also got the studio's assurance that he would get better movie assignments. They kept that promise when Gary was cast in the lead role in A Farewell to Arms. His co-star was Helen Hayes.
Hello, darling.
Catherine.
I have to go now, darling. I can't stay.
You'll come back?
Later, but we'll have to be awfully careful.
You've got to come back.
I will when I can.
Tonight.
I'll try.
Ernest Hemingway's novel was turned into a film the public loved. The New York Daily News proclaimed that Cooper was natural and convincing. This steadfast performance did much to solidify Cooper's image as the stereotypical all-American.
I could kiss you.
In 1933, Gary starred in Today We Live, opposite Joan Crawford. When the film was completed, the famed set designer Cedric Gibbons and his wife, actress Dolores Del Rio, threw a party. At the celebration, Gary met a young actress named Veronica Balfe. Gary was captivated by the charming young beauty who was nicknamed Rocky. She came from a socially prominent New York family. Soon, the pair was inseparable. They married in December of 1933. 4 years later, their only child, Maria, was born.
They were tremendous companions. They were really friends, best friends. And my father loved sports. He loved the outdoors. He loved hunting. He loved shooting. He was a great shot. My mother, in the interest of togetherness, which I would say she believed very much in, she took up shooting, skeet shooting, and she became California State Women's Skeet Champion. And he was so proud of her. I think I was tremendously lucky. I mean, my mother and father and myself were a very, very close threesome. I think they took special attention to keep a family unit. And there was so much of a natural life created apart from movies, apart from films, apart from all the stuff of Hollywood, that it was just beautiful. And it taught me, I think, tremendous values which my mother and father both had, and they passed it on not by lecturing me, but just by the way they lived.
I think she understood him, and that's very important because he was an actor. He was on location a great deal. And in Hollywood, you've got to be a pretty understanding wife if your husband goes away for a month or 2 months. And of course, rumors getting back that there are affairs going. Rocky was able to handle it, and she handled it very well and with dignity. Their marriage was a good one.
By the mid-30s, Gary Cooper had been on screen for a decade. He had risen from the ranks to become a top star and one of the highest paid. Versatility was the key to his success.
We think of him as this cowboy. But in point of fact, you know, the vast majority of his movies were not movies in which he was in, you know, 10-gallon hats and wearing 6 guns. Very often, you know, in a business suit. Could play comedy, which I think is very, very important for stars like that. And they've been around for a while, especially to have to be able to do something other than be strong and silent. You need that humanizing touch that, you know, playing comedy can do.
In 1936, Gary received his first Academy Award nomination for Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. That same year, Gary played Wild Bill Hickok in The Plainsman.
I'm afraid you'll lose, Hickok.
A man's bound to lose, sooner or later.
This expansive Western was historically inaccurate, but a true crowd pleaser. 8 years later, the film became the first movie Maria ever saw in which her father starred.
I remember very clearly. And, okay, there he was on the screen, and that was terrific. Until the part where he's been captured and he's being tortured by the Indians. And they have strung him up with his hands tied together over his head on a pole, and they've hung him over a bonfire. And then, as he's not giving them the information they want, they start to lower him into the fire. Well, that, that did it. I got terrified. This awful thing was happening to my father. And then I saw him standing behind the projection machine, and he just winked at me and grinned, and I said, oh, okay, that's reality, and that's not reality. And it was okay.
In 1937, Paramount delayed renewing Cooper's option. Sam Goldwyn, who had once let Cooper get away, was not about to have it happen again. He agreed to pay Gary $100,000 per film for 3 years. As the 30s decade closed, the Internal Revenue Service announced that Gary Cooper was the highest paid person in America, with an annual income of $482,000. In 1940, Gary wrote into another Western called The Westerner.
William Wyler's The Westerner is one of Cooper's classic Westerns. In it, he plays a gunman who comes into Vinegaroon and meets the famous Western judge, Roy Bean, played by Walter Brennan, who would win an Academy Award for his role. Brennan and his cowboys are trying to run the homesteaders out, and the gunman, just like in Shane later on, will side with the homesteaders against the judge.
You get warrants in Fort Davis, don't you?
Yeah, they get them there, but they don't know how to spell my name. They tried it before.
I'll get one. This time you're going to get what's coming to you, Judge.
Cooper's very, very good in it. He's kind of a prairie con man in it, and so he's slightly varying his type. He's on to Judge Bean and is playing him for his own ends, and there's kind of shrewdness in the humor that's very nice. And just a tiny little stretch for him, but just a nice one. It's important for stars to vary within the context of the basic character they've set up. Play a little humor, play a little tragedy, you know, not too far, but just enough. Keeps things interesting. And I think in that sense, he was shrewd.
Well, you're dead wrong. The little punks have always counted, because in the long run, the character of a country is the sum total of the character of its little punks.
Gary Cooper played the pawn who out-dupes the dupers in Meet John Doe. The film reteamed Coop with his Mr. Deeds director, Frank Capra, and earned Gary his second Academy Award nomination. But the third nomination was the charm. He won the following year for the 1941 film Sergeant York.
York, take over. You hear what I said? I heard you. The rest of you keep under cover. Come back here. Where are you going? You didn't give me command.
Keep an eye on these prisoners. Cooper was about 40 years old, about 10 to 15 years too old for the part, but people accepted it because World War II was approaching, It was patriotic to say this is a great movie. People went to see it. And of course, you couldn't deny it an Oscar because you'd be denying patriotism. So everything worked well for it, coming at the time it did, 1941.
Playing another real-life character, Cooper triumphed again. His portrayal of baseball great Lou Gehrig in The Pride of the Yankees in 1942 is still considered a classic. Gary earned his 4th Oscar nomination.
People all say that I've had a bad break. But today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Years later, doing Gehrig's farewell speech took on new meaning. During World War II, Coop went overseas to entertain the troops. The soldiers had just one request of the superstar.
What the guys want, they want to hear you give the Lou Gehrig speech, the famous Lou Gehrig speech. And my father said, he didn't know that he still knew it, but when he got out on stage and, the response and the warmth and everything from the audience was so beautiful. And the attitude of Lou Gehrig, speaking of heroes, and how Gehrig handled the lumps of life was such an inspiration to all the fighting boys. And that it really touched my father immensely. I love that moment.
2 films with Ingrid Bergman followed, For Whom the Bell Tolls and Saratoga Trunk. As he slipped into middle age, his mere appearance in a movie caused rejoicing. But few of the films he made during the mid to late 40s were cause for cheering. In 1947, Cooper was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, investigating the influence of communism on the Hollywood community.
I am not in nearly as good a position to know as some of the witnesses that have been ahead of me because I'm not a very active member in our guild, and they therefore know much more about the politics and the workings of the what communists there are in the guild than I.
He doesn't hurt anybody in his testimony. He's a friendly witness. And it's in line with his politics, which were conservative. But it's something he said over and over again, and I emphasize it. He never wanted to see anybody get hurt. He never wanted to hurt anybody.
But in 1949, Gary embarked on a path in which people did get hurt. He had left Goldwyn for a 6-picture deal with Warner Brothers. His first film under this new deal was The Fountainhead, a notable film, not so much because of his performance, but because Gary fell in love with his young co-star, Patricia Neal.
One of the things I remember about that period of time, which wasn't easy, but it never is for kids, never did either of them blame the other. Your mother's this, your father's that. I never heard any of that. I never heard them fighting. They kept their private business. And they always made me feel that it wasn't my fault.
Coop moved out of the house he shared with Rocky and Maria.
When they separated was when he fell in love with Patricia Neal. And that was a beautiful romance. And they didn't mean to hurt anybody. Rocky was a Catholic. And Gary knew that she wouldn't divorce him, although she said she wouldn't stand in his way. But he never asked for a divorce, apparently. So he wanted the marriage to last.
The romance thrived for almost 2 years, but eventually ended. Gary reconciled with his wife and converted to her religion, Catholicism.
I think each of them discovered where their heart really lay. I think they admired each other for the way they handled themselves. Nobody lied to me about things, you know. I wasn't trying to pretend. For a few years, they needed their own space, as we say today. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time after they came back together because my father was ill.
For Gary, the 1952 classic High Noon was a comeback of sorts. It had been a long time between hits.
He was earning good money, about $500,000 a year, which was pretty high in those days. But creatively, he was at a lower ebb than usual. And when his affair ended with Neil, ironically or coincidentally, that was about the time that he got the big comeback in High Noon.
He knew it was the right part for him to play. I mean, that is a summarizing, mythic figure that he's playing in that movie. Summarizes every place he'd been. It announces a kind of a real transition to later middle age as an actor.
Marshal, turn in your badge.
But health problems caused by ulcers and a bad back made shooting a real challenge.
I was on the set when they were filming the scene right after they got married, he and Grace Kelly. And the happy groom was supposed to lift up the bride and put her on a bureau. My father had put his back out. And Grace was not 5'2". And if she wasn't a dancer, she didn't know how to lift. So they had to do that scene so many times, and he was in such pain. The cameraman had to keep redoing and redoing it because his face was looking tortured.
Coop's problems with his back and ulcers were taking their toll. He would often rest between scenes. Then came the day to film a crucial fight scene. Because he needed close-ups, the director insisted no stunt doubles be used. The risk was enormous. If Gary was injured, filming would be halted until he recovered. It was a closed set, but co-star Lloyd Bridges secretly brought his young son, Beau, and his wife into the farmhouse location and hid them in a loft. The atmosphere was tense.
We did the fight. We had to roll underneath the horses. And then in the end, he takes his pail of water after he's knocked me out and throws the water on me to revive me. And that was too much for Beau, and he burst out laughing. And Ed Coop had a line right after he does that, and was right on top of the laughter, ruined the whole take. We had to do the whole darn thing all over again. And I thought, you know, I felt so embarrassed about that.
But there were no hard feelings. That night, Coop took the Bridges family out for dinner. And despite the difficulties, High Noon was a triumph. Coop went on to win his second Academy Award. The film also changed the face of Westerns forever.
There was now a psychological impact to Westerns, which in the earlier days had been sublimated or ignored mostly. And now you also had, as cowboy stars were getting older and older, you had a very, very middle-aged cowboy star as the lead. Cooper at that time was 51. And so here you have a weathered man, which made him look more cynical, not so naive, not so young, not so wholesome. And so it gave a whole new temper to Westerns.
The Life and Times of Gary Cooper returns in a moment on TNN.
Walk a quarter of a mile from his camper, his caravan, down to where the police had shut off the location to sign an autograph for a teenage girl. He of course didn't have to do that. And he wasn't physically able, shouldn't have been doing it. And he walked back, you know, uphill. And he never thought a thing about it. I was very grateful for the opportunity of A, having worked with him, and B, having started a film career with him as the star.
The Hanging Tree would be one of Gary's last films. His health was rapidly fading. Besides ulcers and back problems, in late 1960, Coop was diagnosed with cancer, and it was spreading quickly.
In those days, I think the cobalt treatment was basically all they offered. And he had one treatment and he said, no, you know, the hell with it. I'm not going to go through that. He said, if it's God's will. I mean, that was his attitude. He never complained, never carried on. He was in a lot of pain at the end. Never complained or or never said, why me, you know.
Gary's deteriorating health became public knowledge at the 1961 Oscar ceremony. Too sick to attend, Coop's longtime friend Jimmy Stewart accepted an honorary award on Gary's behalf.
And Coop, I want you to know this, that with this goes all the warm friendship and the affection and the admiration and the deep respect of all of us. We're very, very proud of you, Coop. All of us are tremendously proud.
Gary Cooper died less than a month later on May 13th, 1961. He was a few days shy of his 60th birthday.
I love the guy. He just represented everything that I wanted to be. He was an inspiration. He was wonderful to work with.
I just want to go see all his films again because they're so classic. They hold up. They hold up forever. What a legacy. What a legacy he's left.
I think his fame surprised him a great deal. He couldn't believe it. That wasn't what he was after. He achieved a lot more than he expected. Thought he was a very lucky man. Not only that, but to have a wife who stayed with him and loved him, and a beautiful daughter, that was all part of what he never thought he would have at the end.
He was just 60 when he died, so he really got cut off much too soon for his art. I know he felt he was just beginning to understand what acting was about. And he said that very definitely toward the end, with this great frustration and I think anger, if he was personally angry at his life coming to an end and knowing it. The one thing I heard him say was, you know, damn it, just when I was beginning to learn what acting is all about.
He was the last hero. There'll always be Gary Cooper. People who are a generation younger than myself, they all know who Gary Cooper is. And their children will all know who Gary Cooper is, whether they see the movies or not. And if they see the movies, they won't be disappointed.
It isn't new, it's never old, and it's not what you expect. But it's up and coming. It's right in front of you.